let me go ahead. I'm going to get a PowerPoint started. I'll get a brand new one going here for Sark. And by the way, I'm getting a lot of problems with my computer lately. In fact, I hope you can see me because I'm not seeing you guys. Let me see if I can change that. Okay, now I can see you. Let me try that one more time. Okay, there we go. Now we got the Zoom view. Awesome. Yeah, like I'm gonna warn you. Um, last class we were fine, but I've had some other classes. My Saturday class and the class after, there were some glitches, and I kept getting kicked off Zoom. My screen would freeze, and then I would just disappear, and then all of a sudden, I think my computer's going haywire. It's an old computer. I'm running out of memory. That's my hypothesis. I cleared out quite a bit of the memory, so hopefully this won't be too much of an issue. But if I disappear, that's what happens. Hang tight. I think I'm going to defrag it too this weekend, and so hopefully that'll finally fix it. I really need to buy a new computer, but waiting for maybe for Christmas I'll get one for myself. So today we're going to do really just an introduction to Sartre. I'm not going to get that far into the reading. I'm going to mispronounce his name. Typically, a lot of professors like to pronounce his name incorrectly as well, but they'll say Sartre with a hard R at the end. But the French, I think, would prefer my pronunciation, even though it's not correct either. The proper pronunciation is Jean-Paul Sartre, okay? And I just don't want to say Sartre all the time. And it's hard to say, honestly, that real sort of under, silent R. So I just say Sartre. If it's a possessive, like apostrophe S, then the R becomes hard. It's kind of a weird rule with the French. That Sartre is Sartre's book. That actually makes sense. But we're actually going to talk about Sartre's book, Being in Nothingness, and it's a large book. Okay, it's a 700-page book. The essay that we're eventually going to really sink our teeth into is called "Existentialism is a Humanism." Okay, and this, I call it an essay, but really it's a transcript with a few edits made. I really don't like that font. I'm going to try to darken it up a bit. There we go. All right. So ostensibly, again, this is a sort of an introduction to Sartre, but our main goal is to finally get to the actual essay, the book that I had you guys buy for this class, this little textbook here. Today, though, we're going to talk a bit about being in nothingness. That's the title of Sartre's, one of his most important works, you could argue. He wrote this book a few years before he wrote Existentialism is a Humanism. I think I might have my years wrong, but I want to say this is 1945, and Being in Nothingness is 1942, maybe 43. And this book, it was very controversial. In fact, I guess you could argue that Sartre is the most controversial of all the philosophers that we're covering this semester. I don't know. Nietzsche's pretty controversial too. I'd have to think about that. They're both pretty controversial. But he was famous. He was really famous during his lifetime. He was a bit of a celebrity. In France, the intellectuals were kind of like rock stars. They still sort of are. They're, public intellectuals are a big deal in France. But he's writing this book, Being in Nothingness, when he's still a prisoner of war. Much of it is written while he's a prisoner of war under the German occupation during World War II. And when he publishes it, it's well after the war's coming to an end. And the critics of Sartre, these are the people he's answering in this transcript that we're reading, the speech that he gives to this audience. they find this, the fault they find with his work is basically an ethical fault, that Sartre does not provide us with the basis for any ethical judgments. There's nothing in Sartre's philosophy and Being and Nothingness that gives you a clear path to determine what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's evil. There are no a priori values, is one way you can put it. This is one way that Sartre refers to the critique of him, right? That there are no a priori values in any ethical sense. In other words, there are no moral values that are just true, regardless of the context, regardless of, they're just right. For Sartre, nothing has value unless it's in the context of a human engagement with the world. A project is the word that he uses. And for Sartre, he says, again, there are no a priori values. He will acknowledge this, and really no values at all outside of human projects. I can spell this right. I don't know who's got their mic open, but it's kind of distracting. Oh, I figure it out. Sorry, I got you now. All right. Okay, so again, he's this essay that we're looking at. He's responding to these critics of his larger work, which I guess on the face of it, ostensibly, Being in Nothingness, this book, it's not a book about ethics, but the main criticism of Sartre's philosophy in general, which comes to be known as existentialism, is that it doesn't provide us with an ethical basis. The book itself, Being in Nothingness, I can't give you a huge summary of the book because it's 700 freaking pages, and we just don't have time for that. It's really not that important, but I gotta give you a quick overview, because I think that this essay, transcript, whatever you want to refer to it as, it can't really be fully appreciated, I think, without knowing a bit about Sartre's philosophy beforehand. And I think this is one of the reasons Sartre didn't like this essay. He really hated it. As soon as he gave this speech, and then it was published in essay form, he almost immediately disowned it. It's one of his least favorite publications, and ironically, it's his most widely read. It's a very good introduction to existentialism, so I think it's fine. But the problem with it, I think that he saw this himself, was that his defense of existentialism was rather weak. He didn't really fully explain some of his assertions. A lot of the assertions that he makes in this essay, on the face of them, seem quite absurd. For instance, pretty close to the beginning of the essay, he says something like, the good for me is the good for all. And if he means by that what I consider good, let's keep it simple. If I, like for instance, if I say that chocolate ice cream is good, that I think that everyone else should think it's good. It's good for all. That seems absurd. That's not true. I mean, I realize people have their taste. If you don't like chocolate ice cream, that's fine. I do. Maybe you like vanilla or strawberry or some weird Ben & Jerry's flavor or something like this. I'm not going to judge you. I just happen to like this flavor. And so when he says my good is the good for all, he has a very specific meaning. He has a very specific meaning. What does he mean by that? He's not very clear. And then towards the end of the essay, he said something like, the more free that I am, or sorry, I got it reversed. The more free the others are, the more free everybody else is, the more free I am. And so he says, my freedom, this is a big deal for Sartre. Freedom is a big issue for him. But my freedom is tied to the freedom of others, always. And there's this relationship such that if they're more free, the more free they are, that gives me more freedom and more opportunity, more possibility. He asserts this without really explaining that and then giving us examples for why. And in fact, his earlier essay, this one I'm about to summarize very briefly as I can, he seems to assert the opposite in this earlier essay, in Being in Nothingness. He seems to actually make the opposite observation, that other people constrict my freedom and prevent me from acting. And so He's got some explaining to do, and I don't think he does a very good job. He does a pretty good job, I think, in some regards. To be fair to him, I think he's a little too hard on himself by completely disowning this essay. I think he does a fairly good job of just explaining his basic position, and what is existentialism, defining it, and I think he does an okay job of responding to the initial criticisms, which we'll get to at the end of class today. The sort of the two main camps, the communists and the Catholics who don't like him and what they say. I think he does a fairly good job of responding to them and their critiques, but some of the deeper critiques, the sort of, I think, the more damning critiques of his philosophy, he doesn't do that well with. And fortunately for him, he had a big following, and he had a lot of friends who were also philosophers, and some of them came to his aid, notably one of his closest friends, Simone de Beauvoir. I'll mention her probably next week when we get more deep into this stuff, but I'll be borrowing from some of her writings, because she wrote an essay right after he gave this speech a few years later, where she sort of expands upon some of his claims, and so I'll be drawing from that, and when I do, I'll let you know. But so that's basically that's where we're at today. That's where we're going. Let me get started here. Let me talk about being and nothingness, and then we'll finally, this will segue into the ethics, because Sartre himself, like I said, when he's writing Being and Nothingness, he's not writing a book on ethics. This is not a book on values, on ethical values at least. It's actually a book on phenomenology and ontology. So now I've got to introduce you to these terms. In fact, the title of the book, Being and Nothingness, the subtitle is a can you spell it right? Phenomenological essay on ontology. Okay, so as far as I know, I think these are two completely new words for us, except I think maybe we did cover ontology very briefly, but I'd be surprised if you even remember it. But phenomenology and ontology. This is what Sartre is doing in this book. He's doing phenomenology. That's his method. His method is phenomenology, so we'll talk about the method. And he's using this method to do ontology, which is what he's studying. That's ontology, and this is the easier thing to explain, so let's start with that. Ontology is the study of being. So I should even leave being uncapitalized, just kind of just leave it basic, right? What does it mean to be? Are there different types of ways of being? I could say that I am, so I have existence. I'm a being. I'm a type of a being that has existence. And this desk that the computer sits on is. And you are, when I can't see any of you because you all have your cameras turned off, but I'm assuming that some of you are listening, and so you are, and so you all are. You have being. These are all different forms, I guess. I would argue that my being, the being of the desk, the being of the United States government, like the government exists, but how does it exist? They're all types of beings, but what type of beings are they, and what's the difference, and how do we determine the difference, and is there really a difference, and all this? Those are the kind of questions that ontologists will ask, right? That's what ontology does. Now, phenomenology, I'm going to start with the pretty basic definition, which is actually not very helpful because it's almost like too simple. But phenomenology, a little more complicated to explain, studies phenomena. Okay, what does that even mean first? Does anybody even know what the word phenomena means? It's plural. It's plural for the word phenomenon. And I find people get confused about this term because they hear the word phenomenal a lot, and so they think it means something great. Oh, phenomenal! And that's what the adjective usually means. If you say something was phenomenal, that was a phenomenal concert. It was a good concert, right? But the word phenomena, or the singular phenomenon, is actually one of the most like boring words in the English language. Like it's the most general term. Anybody have a definition for it, or like know what it means? What is a phenomenon? Like a scientist might try to explain a particular phenomenon. What does that mean?
Something that's abnormal from the rule.
I know why you say that, but that's actually incorrect, because usually you only hear the word in that context. Usually the only time you hear the word phenomenon is unexplained phenomenon, unusual phenomenon, or phenomena if it's plural. But actually, so that's usually the only time you hear it. But the word in isolation, it just means an event or something that happens. So rain is a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon we can explain with condensation, and science can explain it, but it's still a phenomenon. It's something that happens. So to define phenomenology that way is not very helpful. It studies phenomena. Okay, it studies things that happen. That's it's true. It's kind of a true definition, but it doesn't distinguish it from science. You could argue that biology studies phenomena. Different. It studies life, particular type of phenomenon. Chemistry studies chemical phenomena, physics, physical, whatever. What is phenomenology? It studies, so I'm going to put a couple names up here just to give credit where credit's due. Husserl and Heidegger, right? Both of these men had a big influence on Sartre. They were German philosophers who were developing this method of phenomenology, particularly Husserl. Husserl's often referred to as the father of phenomenology. And the way they distinguished it from science was that science studies phenomena from what they called a third person perspective, what we might call objectively. Okay, so if you're a neuroscientist and you're trying to explain consciousness, you're going to explain consciousness using observations of the brain. You're going to look, doctors are going to come together. They're going to look at people's brains, look at, brain scans, look at neurons firing, etc. And they're going to explain consciousness that way. But phenomenology is going to try to explain it not objectively, but subjectively. So we're going to try to understand consciousness from the point of view of somebody who actually is conscious. So from the first person perspective, to use Husserl's terminology. So instead of trying to answer the consciousness through the mechanics of it, right? The brain creates these patterns, and I'm not going to even get too much into the details because it's going to be embarrassing. My lack of scientific knowledge will be apparent. But that's the scientific explanation. The phenomenologist will, like Sartre, for instance, will try to talk about emotions like shame and guilt. And instead of like a psychologist might talk about it, like what are the causes of shame? What are the causes of guilt? What sort of societal pressure brings along guilt? And Sartre is going to try to understand, what is it like for somebody experiencing guilt? What is that phenomenon like from the inside? And I'm looking at Lenitria's comment. She gives I guess she's giving a definition of phenomenon. I kind of like it. A fact or situation that is observed to exist or happen, especially one whose cause or explanation is in question, right? Yeah, notice that especially, right? So this word is almost exclusively used in that context. You never hear someone say the phenomenon of rain. It's always like, this is an unexplained phenomenon. We have to, explain it. So it's not a commonly used word, but in philosophy, we use sort of the base, meaning of it, the general definition. It's like you said, a fact or situation that is observed to exist. And so when Sartre's, we all feel shame. What is that like? What is it like to feel shame? That's the kind of question the phenomenologist will ask. People like Husserl and Sartre, what they'll do is they'll start with the sort of description. Heidegger does this perhaps to a lesser extent. They'll start with the description of it. They'll maybe recount or recall an event in their life in which they felt shame or pride or whatever emotion it is that they're trying to do a phenomenology of. And they'll maybe give a description of it. And then the next step in the process is to try to extract from that experience all that's unnecessary. So if I take this element away, do I still feel shame? If the answer is no, then that's not an essential part of it. Let me give an example to keep it real simple. I think when we talk about emotions or consciousness, these are pretty abstract and vague notions. And so maybe an example would be easier. Like, let's say I this would be kind of stupid. I don't think Husserl or Heidegger or Sartre would waste their time on this, but we could do like a phenomenology of bottles. Okay. What is it like to experience a bottle? Okay. I could look at this. Okay. So this bottle is see-through, and it has a label. And when I pick it up and I squeeze it, it's kind of soft. Okay. It's not hard like if I picked up a glass bottle and the lid screws off. I just describing my experience of it. Now the second step again is to start removing things, removing elements from that experience and asking that question: would it still be a bottle? Would I still experience it as a bottle? So for instance, let's say the cap didn't screw off. You couldn't screw the cap off. It was one of those like flip top ones. Would it still be a bottle? I think so. I don't think whether it's screw off or flip top, that doesn't really matter. It's still a bottle. So the type of top is unessential. What if it was shaped differently, right? You got this one here that's got sort of this divot in the middle. It gets a little thinner in the middle. And then this one's more uniform, right? It's just sort of, I forget, there's actually a name for this style of bottle, right? It sort of just has the curve at the top and then it's uniform. So it doesn't seem like the shape is that essential to, it still appears as a bottle to me, okay? So you keep extracting until, well, what if it was just a hollow vessel? So you couldn't open the lid, you couldn't put any liquid inside of it. It was just an empty vessel that was sealed off. Would it be a bottle? I don't think so. I would say I would experience it as something else, just like a work. It's a paperweight maybe, or maybe it's a work of art, or maybe it's something. It's definitely not a bottle. It's shaped like a bottle. It's a sculpture that's supposed to be a bottle, but it's fake. It's a gag bottle or something like this. So I think that Husserl would probably be rolling his eyes right now, but I wanted to give you a simple example of how this works, right? Phenomenology, it's, based on your experience of the thing, and then drawing from that experience to try to get the elements that are essential to it. So what is Sark doing in his book when he's doing a phenomenology of ontology, or ontological phenomenology, to use freaking jargon, these crazy philosophy words. He wants to get at this phenomenon of being. What does it mean to be? Okay, so ontology studies being. So when we experience the world as being, when we experience ourselves as being, as having existence, or other things being, what is that like? What is the experience of that? What is the basis for it? What are the essential elements that make beings be what they are? These are the kind of questions that he's delving into. And so the fact that this leads to ethics, it's kind of surprising, but it gets there really quick. Because for Sartre, let me get a new slide going here. Let's talk a little bit about, again, Sartre's ontology, where I swear we're going to get to the essay by the end of class. I promise. Sartre's ontology, his theory of being, is essentially dualistic. Okay? So he's a dualist when it comes to being. Sartre thinks there are two types of being that we all are aware of, that we have access to as human beings. Okay, again, I mentioned earlier that I was having some technical difficulties, and I'm getting messages on my screen that my internet connection is unstable. So bear with me. I'm sorry. If my screen freezes up and I disappear, you know the story. Okay, so I already mentioned that. Hopefully we can pull through this. So again, Sartre's theory of being is dualistic. There are two types of being. The first type of being, let me mention, is being in itself. L'être en soi. And the other is being for itself. Now, a simple way to think about this, and this is really oversimplistic. I think Sartre would probably take issue with this explanation, but for a start, it's not too bad. But one way to think about this, a good way to start, is that the being in itself are the objects of consciousness. So they are things that are for our thoughts. Being for itself is the kind of being that we are as humans experiencing the world. We are all a being for itself. You're a being for itself. I'm a being for itself. We all experience ourselves as being for itself. Okay, so we're gonna expand on this a little bit in a second, but let's talk about Sartre's approach to being in general. Now, for Sartre, he's going to say that whether I'm talking about being in itself or being for itself, anything that is, or that I experience that it is always experienced as being distinct from other things. It's always its own thing. So when I see this bottle, I know that it's its own bottle. It's not the desk that it's sitting on. It's separate from the desk. It's separate from the coaster that it's sitting on. It's separate from me. So essentially for Sartre, what I'm involved in, anytime I take notice of anything, any being, any object, I'm negating all besides it. It involves an active negation, right? It's not this object, it's not that object, it's not this. And for him, when I do this, it's not just some sort of computation that my mind automatically does. It's not some just some logical calculation or mathematical calculation. I'm not just some computer. Like if you've ever seen the Terminator movies, where sometimes it'll show, the Terminator is this robot from the future who's, evil robot guy who comes to kill the good guys in the past or whatever. And every once in a while, when you're watching the Terminator movie, you'll see the world from the point of view of the Terminator robot. And every time he walks into a room, he's assessing the escape route. And when he sees a person, he gets like a readout of their height and their weight and their threat level and all this stuff, like just on this big computer screen in the Terminator's mind. We're not like that, says Sartre. We notice things without even noticing them, right? We know that we're sitting down even when we're not sitting down. Like, you're probably, if you are sitting down right now, you're aware of it without thinking about it. Maybe now you're thinking about it because I just pointed it out to you. But you're still aware of it. And so these objects stand out to you.